Good afternoon and welcome to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights briefing on anti-Asian racism in the United States. Thank you to the witnesses, staff, and guests who are joining us today, whether in person or virtually. The briefing comes to order at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're holding the briefing in the National Press Club. I'm Commissioner Peter Kirsanow. I'll be moderating the briefing today. I'll be joined by Commissioner Adams, Commissioner Garza, trying to do this in alphabetical order, Commissioner Gilchrist, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Magmantai, and Commissioner Nurse. A quorum of the commissioners is present. Staff Director is present right to my right here. Present. Mauro Morales. Is the court reporter present? Thank you very much. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome our newly appointed commissioners who are with us today. Commissioners Garza, Magmantai, I keep screwing that up, Magmantai, and Nurse. Commissioner Mondaire Jones is unable to join us today, but we look forward to welcoming him in the future. Since we're a little pressed for time today, I'll briefly introduce each of our new commissioners, and they may wish to say a few words. Commissioner Rochelle Garza was appointed by President Biden and sworn in on March 17th of this year. She's an attorney from the Rio Grande Valley, currently serving as president of the Texas Civil Rights Project. She has expertise in immigration, family, criminal, and constitutional law. Commissioner Glenn Magmantai was appointed to the commission by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and sworn in on February 15th of 2023. He's a longtime civil rights attorney, professor of law and Asian American studies, and LGBTQ rights activist. He is a principal at Magmantai and Associates Anasaurus Equality Fellow. And last, Commissioner Victoria Nurse was appointed to the commission by President Biden and sworn in on March 16th of 2023. She's the Ralph Whitworth Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law School. She's also taught at a number of other institutions such as Yale, NYU, and Northwestern. She's authored textbooks and dozens of legal articles. Welcome to our new commissioners. Would each of you, starting with Glenn, like to say a few words?
Sure. It's an incredible honor to be here, to have this opportunity to serve our country and to raise these issues that so importantly affect our community. As Asian Americans who are growing in this country, the distinct honor of being an Asian American member of this commission, but really looking at the rights and issues that affect all Americans across this country. It was 30 years ago that this commission unveiled a report called Civil Rights Issues in the 90s. And I remember when I was a young law student researching my law review article, there was nothing out there about the Asian American community. And yet this commission, well before I even became an admitted attorney, provided the insights and information that we needed to look at the growing community in our country. I'm so excited for all the panelists to be on this commission, to serve our country, and for the important issues that we have here today, and for the work of the commission for the next couple of years. Thank you.
Commissioner Nurse.
Well, thank you so much. I've been delighted and honored to be nominated by President Biden, who I've known since I was a 30-year-old lawyer working on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I'm delighted to be nominated with a phenom from Texas, Rochelle Garza, who's going to speak in a minute. But I just know that the president, if he were here today, he would say this is exactly the example of what I used to do in the Senate. We work better together than apart. And that the United States needs right now so much, in particular in the Asian sphere, to be a leader in human rights. So I'm delighted that this is our first hearing, and I look forward to hearing from your testimony.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is truly an honor for me to have been appointed by President Biden to this very important position. I deeply, deeply care about civil rights. You know, I'm a civil rights attorney from South Texas. My father was a farmer. He was one of 13 children. I've been thinking a lot about my grandmother, a lot about the future of my daughter. She turns 1 today. And so I want to make sure that we make this country or continue to go on the path where there is equal protection for everyone in this country, because I deeply believe that. I am very excited that this is the first panel that will be hearing from about this incredibly important topic about anti-Asian bias that is impacting people across this country. So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the new commissioners, or condolences. The subject of today's hearing, the federal response to anti-Asian racism in the United States. This is a topic that former Commissioner Yaki, from whom we will be hearing a little bit later today, and who, by the way, speaks fluent Klingon, had the pleasure, he proposed this topic last year, and all of us have been alarmed by news reports of attacks against Asian Americans. This has been going on for some time. I had been involved in this and tried to get a briefing on this issue myself, and here we are. I'm happy that we're going to be addressing this at this time, and I thank the Commission staff and our special assistants and everyone for putting this thing together, all the hard work that it entailed, and getting knowledgeable witnesses to testify in front of us. The Commission will hear from 3 panels of expert witnesses. The first panel consists of policy and research experts. The second panel will consist of community stakeholders and advocates, and the third and final panel consists of law enforcement and federal officials. Now, the logistics of it are each panelist gets 7 minutes in which to speak. Now, there's a system of warning lights there set up so you know how long you have left. If it turns from green to yellow, that's your signal that you now have 2 minutes left to speak. And of course, when the light turns red, you are to stop, otherwise SEAL Team 6 comes in the door and escorts you out. After each presentation, commissioners will have an opportunity to ask some questions of the witnesses, and then there will be a 10-minute break between panels. So with that, we'll begin the briefing. This first witness, our first witness panel consists of Dr. Russell Zhong, who's professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate. Second panelist is Charles Lehman, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Joanne Yu is next to him, executive director of Asian American Federation. Diane Yap, founding member of Friends of Lowell Foundation and board member of the Lowell Alumni Association, and John Yang, who is president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And I see we've got Brian Levin here, and I don't have a bio for you. Sorry about that.
My father wanted me to be a doctor.
His father wanted him to be a doctor, and that's why he's been consigned to being here today. And you are a professor at California State, I've seen your name before. California State University, San Bernardino, director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. Thank you very much all for appearing and for testifying today. Dr. Zhong, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'd like to thank the Commission on Civil Rights for hosting this hearing. It's a really important topic, and I also like to thank the staff who so professionally and organized this event. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with an incident that we received at Stop AAPI Hate that sadly is all too common. As you could see and read, it's not necessarily an issue of a hate crime, but one of racial harassment, where a woman customer was denied access at her pharmacy. The perpetrator, using yellow peril rhetoric, not only saw her as being a disease-carrying, threatening person of color, but instead stated that she was the infection, that our racialized bodies themselves were the defiling elements to the United States. And so he told her to go home, we don't want you here. And you could see the traumatizing result. This person was in shock and cried and left, saying no one came to help. She left isolated, marginalized. And I think that's the experience of the Asian American community at this moment, one of collective racial trauma. Thanks. Next slide. So according to surveys, national surveys, random samples, translated in different languages, 8 to 45% of Asian Americans have faced this type of racism, this type of harassment across the nation. Since we make up the fastest growing minority in the United States, these numbers translate to 2 million to 10 million cases of hate during the pandemic. So it clearly is an epidemic of hate. It clearly is a time of collective racial trauma. Next slide. But the racism we're seeing now have particular sources. Asian Americans face a sort of a unique set of factors that lead to racism against us. Clearly, people were afraid of COVID-19 because of the disease, but the political rhetoric and social media today really did exacerbate the issue. When politicians used the term Chinese virus, it really did two things. It racialized the virus, so it made it Chinese, and it stigmatized the people, so Chinese people were the ones carrying the disease. That association that the virus was Chinese and Chinese had the virus really did go viral on social media, and that's been correlated with anti-Asian hate. The other key factor really fomenting anti-Asian hate that maybe other groups don't experience as much is that U.S.-Asian foreign relations translates to American race relations for Asian Americans. And those who see China as the country's main threat then tend to see Asians in the U.S. negatively, and that leads to greater anti-Asian sentiment. So we have to get at these factors, we have to get at these sources if we really want to uproot the racism. The impacts have been devastating. Racism has incurred severe costs in our community. Asian businesses have lost 60% of their income since the start of the pandemic compared to 12% of the national average, 5 times more. And because of this business loss, large swaths of our community have been unemployed during the pandemic. Because of the fear of COVID, because we're seen as the yellow peril or the dusky peril, policies have been institutionalized that actually, again, see us as dangerous outsiders to be banned, to be excluded. Individually, these policies may be unintentionally benign, but taken as a whole, these policies have really had a chilling effect on our community, have deprived us of the rights to migrate, deprived us of the rights to reunite our families, deprived us of the rights to free speech, deprived us even of freedom of religion on social media. So again, this institutionalized policy have sanctioned greater anti-Asian hate. Next slide. And finally, over 50 studies have concluded that this period has been really traumatizing. And those of us who experience direct racism are even more traumatized, leading to de facto segregation. People are not going out, being sequestered in certain neighborhoods for fear of danger. Next slide. So to wrap up, I make these suggestions. I think we do need to get at the particular sources of anti-Asian hate. We need to really pay attention to how U.S. foreign relations impacts Asian Americans. Next slide. We have to see this period as not one of just hate crimes, but really a civil rights issue. And so we need to make sure that Asian Americans and other groups receive public accommodations, that they have safe access to goods. We have to really ensure that the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act is fully implemented, and that would then promote anti-harassment campaigns to promote empathy. Next slide. And finally, I think we really need non-punitive efforts to build racial unity, to educate our community, to create empathy. Education really is a key across the board. Asian Americans polled realize that education is the best way to remedy racism. But I'm really alarmed at this moment by the backwards movement that is calling on bans of books that are curbing discussions of race and racism. It's really impacting teachers and students from having frank discussions of race. And so we have to actually guard the civil rights of our teachers, of our students, so that they have that freedom of speech to address racism. And I'm actually, alarmed. I'm an alumnus of Lowell High, and some alumnus at Lowell High are seeking to file a lawsuit that may impact other students of color. And I just hope that in our efforts that we would improve the educational opportunity for everybody, not just a select few. We can't just gain Asian American civil rights at the expense of others. So thank you. Again, this period of the yellow peril is frightening. It's not an Asian American issue we're dealing with. It's an American issue, right? It's Americans who are afraid of COVID. It's Americans who are afraid for their national security. It's Americans who are afraid of their economic standing. And to the extent that we can address those fears and create an Asian American civil rights agenda, then I think we could expand equal opportunity. We can expand education for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jean. Mr. Lehman, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you to the Commission for the opportunity to address you. I am speaking to you today in my capacity as an analyst of crime. With my time, I want to make 3 points. First, anti-Asian hate crime has risen substantially thanks to both the COVID-19 pandemic and to an increase in criminal offending generally. This latter is because, second, hate crime offenders are quite similar to other criminals and often commit other crimes. Therefore, third, the best way to combat hate crime is not by targeting hate, e.g. through education or content moderation, but to target crime through aggressive law enforcement. After decades of decline, anti-Asian hate crime began rising in 2017, then spiked dramatically in 2020. That year's official count, 279, is a 73% increase over 2019. Reported incidents rose yet again in 2021, a cumulative 89% increase over 2019. This last finding is particularly remarkable given the reported counts of many other categories of hate crimes fell in 2021. When thousands of agencies did not report hate crimes because of the FBI's transition to a new reporting system. The measured increase in anti-Asian offending is therefore biased downwards. The true number is probably much higher. Further support for this trend comes in data from New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, collectively home to roughly 10% of the US Asian population. Anti-Asian hate crimes have increased in all 3 cities. At least in these cities, though, there have been 2 waves of crime. In both Los Angeles and New York, incidents spiked in the second quarter of 2020, around the time the coronavirus began spreading in the United States, then fell, before spiking again in early 2021, when they also began rising in Chicago. A similar pattern appears in data from San Francisco. This suggests that the increase in anti-Asian hate crime is not as simple as the coronavirus crisis starting a new wave of anti-Asian racism. If it were, one would expect incidents to have risen continuously from Q2 2020 onwards. Most importantly, 2021 saw not only an increase in anti-Asian racism, but also increased crime among the individuals most likely to convert that racism into criminal behavior. Homicides rose nearly 30% in 2020, another 5% in 2021. A similar trend obtains for shootings. And in many jurisdictions, including the ones previously mentioned, other kinds of crime have risen as well. As social control has ebbed, in other words, criminal offenders of all types have been more prone to acting out. This implies, though, that hate crime offenders are like other criminals as opposed to being specialists in hate crime. The data bear this out. One survey of convicted hate crime offenders found that 87% had a prior conviction, including 60% with a violent conviction. Another survey of UK offenders found that 97.7% of hate offenders had prior arrests, including 87% who had committed a crime of violence. Data on arrest records from New York also suggests a similarity between hate criminals and non-hate criminals. While hate crime offenders vary demographically from others, they look essentially indistinguishable on measures of criminality, including whether they have previously been convicted, whether they have an open case, whether they're rearrested following release on bail. What about those who commit anti-Asian hate crimes? High-profile incidents suggest that prior criminality is not uncommon. Antoine Watson, who murdered 84-year-old Wicha Ratanapakdee, one of the earliest anti-Asian offenses in 2020, was in the process of vandalizing another car when he assaulted Ratanapakdee. He'd been cited for reckless driving earlier that day. Pascal Allen, who allegedly assaulted an 83-year-old Asian man in 2021, was on probation when he committed his offense. The reason for this phenomenon is intuitive. While many people hold bigoted views, most will not convert them into criminal acts. To do so requires some other disinhibition. That sort of disinhibition also leads to committing other crimes. To put it graphically, a hate crime offender is someone who thinks it's both a good idea to brutalize someone on the street and to scream racial slurs while doing so. That some other criminals do not yell racial slurs while they brutalize people does not mean that they do not share key characteristics with hate crime offenders. The consequence of this insight is simple. To combat hate crime, focus on crime. The wrong policy is to focus on reducing bias through education or social media content moderation. Such approaches are not only ineffective on their own terms, a large research literature casts doubt on educational intervention's efficacy, but inefficient because they poorly target the small subset of the biased population that will actually criminally offend. The marginal student or social media commenter is not likely to become a hate criminal. Spending resources on him is a bad bet on crime control dollar for dollar. Rather, the criminal justice system, including the federal criminal justice system, is well equipped to combat hate crime as crime. Multiple statutes, especially the 2009 Hate Crimes Prevention Act, permit the federalization of many bias-related offenses. Yet recent data suggests DOJ has been slow to use these powers. It investigated only about 120 hate crimes per year from 2015 to 2019, declining to prosecute in 77% of cases. Just 82 defendants faced charges. Rates have increased in recent years as justice charged more than 40 people and obtained 35 convictions between January 2021 and May 2022. Still, the relatively low numbers suggest the department could be doing more, including coordinating more closely with state and federal task forces. In addition to directly prosecuting hate crimes, the Department of Justice every year issues tens of millions of dollars in anti-hate crime grants. While these are substantial amounts, they don't go that far. Fiscal year 2022 funding covered just 22 awards compared to roughly 2,300 state prosecutors' offices. Many offices do not have specialists focused on hate crime prosecutions. The challenge inherent in prosecuting bias-motivated crime means the federal government could allocate more funding to at least coordinating between offices and articulating best practices to increase the often shockingly low rate of convictions. Another approach is to increase police hiring, a proven tool for reducing crimes of all sorts. Across a variety of measures, police to population ratios have declined steadily since the Great Recession. DOJ's main hiring grant office is authorized to spend $386 million in fiscal 2021, including $156 million for its primary program. It's a dramatic decline from the $1.4 billion a year it was given in the 5 years after its authorization. Lastly, many particularly heinous hate crimes are, under federal law, eligible for capital punishment, including high-profile hate crimes like the Emmanuel AME church shooting and the Buffalo Tops Market shooting. In light of this, the Biden administration's ongoing death penalty moratorium poses a serious challenge to the orderly proceeding of justice. When discussing crime, we too often insist that to reduce it, we must first end poverty, addiction, despair, other root causes. The same is often true for hate crime. To reduce it, many insist that we need to root out hatred in hearts and minds. Reality, hate crime offenders are like other criminals, which means that hate crime offending should be responsive to the traditional tools of crime control. Smart policing and prosecution should be the frontline defense in blunting the spike in anti-Asian hate crime. The federal government is well positioned to enact this agenda. It should do so. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lehman. Ms. Yu?
Commissioners, I apologize in advance as this has been a very triggering and emotional 3 years for me. My name is Joanne Yu, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation in New York. We're the strongest leadership organization serving Asian Americans, working in collaboration with 70 member and partner agencies who are deeply embedded in our communities and operate in the larger umbrella of human services. We are best positioned to address community issues across different Asian ethnicities to quickly and efficiently tackle emerging challenges like the anti-Asian hate. Today, I'm here to represent the victims of anti-Asian violence in New York because they deserve to be named, to be recognized, and honored. My organization raised and subgranted more than $3 million to 33 Asian-serving members and partner agencies to implement our Hope Against Hate campaign. In our first year of the campaign, we distributed over 50,000 safety resources and supported nearly 10,000 individuals with safety trainings, help with reporting incidents, and connections to victim services. In January 2020, the first warning signs of the brainstorm came from the Asian small businesses, which reported a significant drop-off in customer traffic due to news of the COVID outbreak in China. In response, we immediately began working with elected officials to develop response strategies aimed at keeping Asian Americans, Asian New Yorkers safe. By February, we started to receive reports of anti-Asian violence through our members, partners, and personal contacts. The stories I heard from strangers who called or emailed me at all hours of the day and night are beyond heartbreaking, and I want you to hear some of their stories. I'm going to tell you about the frontline healthcare workers who kept us alive during the height of COVID, who talked about having to consider early retirement because they were afraid of being physically attacked going to and from work. Or how about the 90-year-old grandmother who was out for an evening walk in a Brooklyn neighborhood when she was set on fire by 2 teenagers? She was too scared to tell anybody, including her own family. And the hundreds of small business owners who were afraid for themselves, their families, their employees, and their customers, and consulted with us to implement safety protocols. Let me tell you about Noel, one of the most gentle people I've ever met, who was slashed from ear to ear as he was going to work in the morning and required over 100 stitches to close a gaping wound. Scars that are still healing 2 years later, not to mention his mental and emotional trauma. He has chosen to forego plastic surgery as a reminder that hate violence continues to plague our community. Vilma was on her way to Mass on Palm Sunday when she was knocked to the ground and kicked in the face and pelvis by an assailant who yelled, "You don't belong here," in a country where she has lived for decades. And on March 3rd, just a few weeks ago, Cecile and her son Kyle were returning from family lunch when they were repeatedly called racial slurs and beaten in their own neighborhood. Cecile was punched repeatedly until she lost consciousness. Her son, who has served our country as a Marine, sustained skull fractures trying to protect his mother and will deal with long-term impacts from his injuries. And then there is my story. I was walking to visit my local small businesses when a man decided to block my path and refused to let me pass. I'm a person with tremendous privilege. I work closely with the Attorney General's office, the mayor, the governor, and other elected leaders. But my privilege did not protect me from potential harm in my own neighborhood. These are the real life stories of Americans living through this horror right now. This is our daily reality, The pain and trauma of Asian New Yorkers motivated the Asian American Federation to launch the Hope Against Hate campaign in 2021, which is an expansive response network of Asian nonprofits working together to provide safety programming and services. Together, we connect victims to legal, financial, and mental health support, as well as equip vulnerable women, children, and young people with safety measures to prevent attacks from happening in the first place. If you think you are strong, I invite you to come and watch 80-year-old grandmothers, some with canes, learn self-defense techniques to keep themselves safe from attacks, because it will break you, as it has broken me many times. In April 2020, we launched a reporting platform in Asian languages to make it easier for victims to report incidents and seek help in their native languages. In the first 6 months of the COVID lockdown, the Federation worked with our member and partners to track victim reports, some of which totaled over 400 in the largest Asian neighborhoods in New York City. At the Federation, we have taken on the responsibility on behalf of our communities to publicly honor victims of anti-Asian hate with the singular purpose of sharing their stories, because if we don't, who will speak for the victims? I am grateful for this opportunity to speak and give voice to the urgent needs of Asian Americans who continue to experience anti-Asian assault on a daily basis, more than 3 years since the first COVID-related attack. Concrete actions must begin today if we aim to prevent more attacks from occurring again. We urge the following. 1, investing in the strengthening and expansion of local networks so victims have ready access to community-based places where they can report attacks, receive support services, and take safety trainings and workshops in their own languages. We need system changes to correctly label and track violence for every category, including religious identification. For instance, the highest rate of anti-Sikh attacks are in New York State, but there doesn't exist a category to track an attack as anti-Sikh, so those numbers are ignored. Our partner organization, the Sikh Coalition, reports that there has been a rise in attacks against Sikhs because the men wear turbans, making them a visible target for hate violence. Over 50% of Asian New Yorkers have limited English proficiency. I have heard from seniors tell me that they tried to report a hate attack, only to be turned away because there was no police officer who could take a report in the language the victim spoke. We must invest in language services and resources. Disturbingly, the media gaze has moved on from anti-Asian hate, and the investments have also waned. Despite these realities, incidents of violence have not stopped. We cannot let this racist, violent pattern of behavior become the norm. We need a new normal that recognizes the Asian American community as being integral to this country's identity. Our community has yet to see any solutions that we in the front lines have proposed. Statements of solidarity matter only if they are backed up with concrete action. Our leaders can and must do more. In the meantime, we continue with our work, which remains necessary as one of the only few resources for the victims. As I have sat with the victims, held their hands and cried with them, I have asked all of them, what does justice look like for you? And today I want to ask this commission the same question. What does justice look like for us Asian Americans? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yu. Ms. Yap, you have 7 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Diane Yap, and I was born and raised in San Francisco. Unfortunately, my city has changed over the years into one where Asian seniors are afraid to leave their own homes. There's been a surge of violent and often fatal attacks against Asians. Just a few examples. 70-year-old Mrs. Ren was shoved to the floor, beaten, kicked in the head by 3 teens and an 11-year-old. 2 elderly women were stabbed with a machete while waiting for a bus. A 15-year-old boy was stabbed in the neck on the bus by a 12-year-old boy. However, none of these brutal attacks have been classified as hate crimes. Hate crimes, while certainly on the rise, are a small fraction of the violence faced by Asians in this country. According to the Department of Justice's 2021 Criminal Victimization Report, Asians were the victims in nearly 170,000 violent incidents, while the number of anti-Asian hate crimes in 2021 was just 305. This is not to minimize the impact of hate crime victimization, but to put the scope of the problem into proper context. The danger in restricting our analysis to just hate crimes is that we misdiagnose the cause. Who is responsible for these attacks against Asians? It appears that attacks against Asians only stirred interest on Capitol Hill once there was a way to blame conservatives or white supremacy, like that oft-repeated statistic that 75% of anti-Asian hate crimes are perpetrated by white people. Diving into the source material reveals it's based on incidents from 4,337 news articles about coronavirus-related anti-Asian racism in the United States. Of these, there were just 12 incidents with physical contact where the race of the perpetrator was known. Of those 12, 9 had white perpetrators, hence 75%. By comparison, the same study included 55 tweets from Donald Trump alone. Yet, a tweet never put grandma in the hospital. The urgent issue of violence against Asians predates COVID. The 2018 Criminal Victimization Report by the Bureau of Justice Statistics shows violent incidents by race of victim and offender. The largest share, 27.5%, are perpetrated by Black offenders, while Asians commit just 0.1% of such attacks against Black victims. If all those living nearby were equally likely to attack Asians, Blacks are attacking Asians at more than 3 times the expected rate, as the average Asian lives in a neighborhood that's just 8% Black. On the other hand, white and Hispanic people are attacking Asians at about half the expected rate. This is not new. A 2008 analysis on physical assault crimes in San Francisco showed that in 85% of cases, the victim was Asian and the perpetrators were African American. Sadly, government policymakers and media outlets do not want to acknowledge that Black on Asian violence is a problem. And racial resentment is at the root of the problem. This resentment is well explained by the middleman minority concept. Immigrants who occupy a low barrier niche in the economy, like retail, and via punishing work schedules and self-sacrifice, ascend from poverty to prosperity, often within 1 generation. Middleman minorities have faced violence throughout history because native populations of lower status feel entitled to the same outcomes. Today's expectation of equal outcomes can be summarized by one word: equity. The repetition of this term in policy discussions implies that all outcomes should be doled out proportionately amongst different racial groups, regardless of relevant factors such as behavior. But we should expect proportionate outcomes only if these are assigned at random. But police don't arrest people at random. Courts don't imprison people at random. The government does not randomly force anyone to drop out of high school, nor does it randomly assign anyone to a life of poverty. All of these outcomes depend largely on behavior and individual choices. When you are repeatedly told that outcomes are unfair because they are racially disproportionate, it is natural to resent the beneficiaries of this imagined unfairness. Unfortunately, such a mindset breeds racial resentment and thus anti-Asian hate. While the focus of this hearing is anti-Asian hate crimes, any given Asian individual in the US, out of a total population of about 18 million, is statistically unlikely to be the victim of a hate crime. On the other hand, anti-Asian discrimination in education figures prominently in the life of every Asian American. When I was 12, I saw my friend sobbing at school after acceptance letters to Lowell High arrived. She missed the cutoff score for Chinese students by just 1 point. If she had been any other race, she would have gotten in. Selective high schools like Lowell High in San Francisco, the Screen Schools of New York City, and #1 ranked Thomas Jefferson in Virginia are all fighting misguided attempts to make their student bodies match area demographics, equity. All of these attempts involve degrading or eliminating the consideration of academic proficiency in admissions. Asians bear the brunt of these unconstitutional attempts at racial balancing. Even at Harvard, an Asian applicant with a 25% chance of getting in would have a 95% chance if he were only able to check the African American box instead. Nothing else about him would have to change. The role of the government is not and should not be to put the thumb on the scale in order to produce racially proportionate outcomes. The goal should not be equal outcomes or equity, but rather equal opportunity. The government's role is to ensure that no one faces discrimination on the basis of race. On the matter of hate crimes, that means better crime prevention generally in the form of increased police presence, surveillance of hotspots, predictive policing, and especially imprisonment of repeat offenders. On the issue of affirmative action, that means recognizing that such policies discriminate against Asians in favor of objectively less qualified applicants. If you believe that underrepresented groups deserve special help, then you also believe that there are overrepresented groups that deserve to be discriminated against. These are inextricably linked, and the latter is clearly unconstitutional. If the Supreme Court bans race-based affirmative action, it is the duty of the government to enforce the ban as vigorously as it once enforced Brown v. Board of Education. Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you, Ms. Yap. Mr. Yang?
Thank you. Thank you to the Commission for holding this important hearing. My name is John Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice at AAJC. Professor Zhang has laid out some of the root causes of anti-Asian hate and its impact, and Joanne has contextualized this with the life experiences that we all feel every single day. I want to talk about how the government can move forward by focusing on solutions, on language, on education, and on community. First, on language. Professor Zhang illustrated, whenever the United States has an economic or national security concern, Americans of Asian descent have faced a backlash. To be clear, I am not saying that these threats are not real. We do have real geopolitical tensions with the Chinese Communist Party and the authoritarian government, whether there's the Xinjiang Muslim minority in Xinjiang, whether it's democracy in Hong Kong, whether it is free speech with respect to Chinese citizens. But even as we talk about these issues, we must be careful to use the proper nuance and exercise responsibility in our language. We must affirmatively emphasize that Asian Americans are Americans and contribute to our economy, our well-being, our liberty, and our prosperity. We must be careful to distinguish between the Chinese governmental action on the one hand and Chinese and Asian Americans and the society on the other. When federal officials suggest that this is an all-of-society problem, or that all Chinese students or scholars or scientists are suspected of being spies for the Chinese government, this creates a suspect class where Chinese Americans and Asian Americans are deemed to be spies in the minds of all Americans. References to Asian Americans as being sneaky, cunning, untrustworthy feed on stereotypes that lead to this hate that we are talking about. We would encourage all relevant federal agencies to work with all stakeholders to develop best practices for language. In talking about language, I also would emphasize the need for language access. 1/3 of the Asian American community is limited English proficient. And that means that if material is presented only in English, we will not be able to access it and use it. Toward that end, this commission in May of 2020 said that Asian Americans must always, for this commission and the federal government, must always take into account the critical requirement to provide language access for limited English populations. I would note that the media advisory agenda for this hearing was done in Chinese and Vietnamese. Under Executive Order 13166, Federal agencies and entities receiving federal funding are required to provide meaningful access to agency services and limited English proficient individuals. In practice, we have found that significant gaps in these resources and for our LEP populations that are underserved. I would urge federal agencies to review their compliance with Title VI and Executive Order 13166. Second, let me talk about education. To dispel the myth of the perpetual foreigner or the model minority, we need to ensure that education is inclusive of all marginalized communities, including the Asian American community. This is a root cause that we must address. This includes ensuring expeditious funding and work on the creation of a national museum for Asian Pacific American history and culture. This includes Asian Pacific American history in K through 12 education. This is part of a larger effort that all of us share, that all of us need to address together to tell a full account of American history that is inclusive of Asian Pacific Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and LGBTQ Americans. All of these communities have too often been ignored in history books, left out of social studies, and these communities' authors have been silenced, ignored, or banned. Also on the subject of education, I respect my colleagues, including friends like Lee Chang, who will testify later, on whom I differ on subjects such as magnet schools and affirmative action. But in our assessment, these are not examples of anti-Asian racism, which is the subject of today's hearing. These policies are designed to create greater opportunities for bright and meritorious students who do not have equitable resources and who are often overlooked. It is recognition that the merits of a student exclude so much more and extend beyond test scores and grades. Indeed, many Asian Americans and Asian Pacific Americans have benefited from these policies. On affirmative action, there's one important thing to recognize, is that Asian Americans support affirmative action. Polling has demonstrated this time and again. But more importantly, affirmative action is not about quotas. It is not about lowering the bars to admissions. Rather, it is simple recognition that race still matters in our country and that a student must be able to express their full story, including their story about their own race. Again, any discussion about college admissions must be holistic. 20 to 30% of college admissions for prestigious universities are based on relatives to alumni, relatives to staff, based on sports scholarships, and the so-called president's list, which consists of donors and what are considered notable figures. We are contorting the discussion if we only focus on affirmative action. Lastly, I would want to touch on community and how the federal government can make itself more accessible to our community. Legislation such as the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, the Jabbar Hired No Hate Act, has been helpful to many in our community. It's provided grants to our community groups fighting hate. It includes innovative models like restorative justice that many communities embrace. It recognizes that reporting hate should happen not only through law enforcement, but health services. Those are examples of where the federal government is making a difference in responding. I know that Manju Kulkarni will dive into more deeply the subject of data, and the work of Stop AAPI Hate has been wonderful for contributing to our community. One thing I do want to emphasize, and respectfully referring to the prior speaker, one thing I want to make clear is the narrative cannot be about African American on Asian hate. That is why these statistics are important. And I understand we have disagreements about them, but the statistics consistently show that African Americans are not overrepresenting in hate incidents against the Asian American community. And this is important because this is creating a division, a divisiveness that is unnecessary within all of our communities. While the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act does provide examples of where the federal government can help, federal government can do more. With respect to grants, the grant-making process is often opaque and cumbersome, especially for communities that really struggle and would benefit most from the money. Without focused outreach and local touchpoints, federal government will not be trusted and will not be used by our community. Sustained commitment to engagement in culturally and linguistically sensitive manners is critical. Look, there's much work to be done, and I'm hopeful that a report by this commission highlighting these issues will spur not only federal agencies to take greater action, but for all policymakers to do so as well. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Mr. Levin?
Commissioners, thank you so much for having me today. There's a great American who said the following: if you have the feeling that something is wrong, don't be afraid to speak up. He further said, every day in school we said the pledge to the flag with liberty and justice for all, and I believed all that. That's Fred Korematsu, okay? It's time that we set the record straight for our Asian American brothers and sisters, and also set the record straight on incorrect information that has just come up today before this panel. But let me just introduce myself to you. I'm the son of a felon. My father lied about his age as a teenager to go to Europe to fight the Nazis and was captured as a teenager 78 years ago and was one step away from death. The rest of my resume doesn't matter. But you can look it up if you like. And I'm in the New York Times today. Thank you so much for your long-standing work. The year that they barred 9 black students from Little Rock High was when you got your marching orders to make America what it aspires to be. And what an honor to be here with all of you. And thank you all. I've been doing this for over 36 years. And my research has been used in the promulgation of every major federal hate crime law, including the Hate Crime Statistics Act. So let me just, I'm throwing this out, because I gotta set the record straight here. First of all, your data is wrong. The FBI just updated its data. It's not 305, it's 746, and that doesn't include Pacific Islanders. If we could go to some slides, I'm just gonna get straight to it. This is the increase in reported hate crime. Okay? By the way, if you look at Bureau of Justice statistics, no, it's not the same as violent crime overall. In fact, violent hate crimes have risen more over the last decade that they did their research. We could go to the next slide real quick, because I don't have a lot of time. If you look in the bottom, look at that explosion in 2020. Those months from June forward were worse than any month in the previous decade. Let's go forward again. We don't have a lot of time. This is the latest data. By the way, I'm sure someone's going to twist it, okay? This is 20 to 21, where we saw a record. We saw a record in anti-Asian violence. And this is FBI. By the way, FBI is also wrong. Okay, they said there was 11.6% increase. It was a 31% increase in 21. Just use their top line numbers. Because what they did is they kind of compared like the Dow Industrials to the Russell 5000. And you can't do that. So let's move forward. This is anti-Asian hate crime in the United States. We have had an invisible record because we have had instances where the FBI has had to supplement its data for the last 2 years. By the way, the people who are in charge of that program are very nice people, and I asked them to supplement it, so I'm not trying to sound angry, but they have to deal, like a professor has to deal with students, they have to deal with 18,000 agencies that don't turn in their homework on time. But, and let me just tell you about the data. Let's look at this, because we found in our latest multi-city study, which is very accurate, we showed a 29% increase in 2021, FBI showed 31%. 73% in 2020, 167% in 2021. In the cities, it was even more. FBI, we don't know. But we had a 35% decline in the major cities in anti-Asian hate crime. Guess what? That would still be a record if it wasn't for 2021. So we're talking about like, oh, wow, well, we had a slightly better Category 5 tornado or hurricane. And what I'm afraid is people are going to use that number and say, oh, whoa. If we could move forward with the slides, please. Again, we saw records in 2020. I'm sorry, we saw record months in 2020. And by the way, yes, you see how it went down? Guess what? If you were to look at the first quarter of 2021, after the insurrection, and yes, it was an insurrection, when we had a shift to debates about vaccines, and we saw an increase in hospitalizations. Like we saw more anti-Asian hate crimes just in New York City alone. That was about a quarter, I think, of the increase in the whole country. So we saw quite a bit. By the way, is all data limited? Yes, I don't have the time to go into all the limitations. Now, with respect to being like all crime, you can't cherry pick homicides. That's like less, it's like a fraction of 1%, okay? all the major research, whether it's Nolan and Bennett in 2006 or McDevitt, there are different types of offenders, and you can't treat them all the same, okay? In New York City, in the first half of 2021, just about 49% of hate offenders were listed as emotionally disturbed persons. And as the only person on the panel who actually arrested people in New York, let me tell you, that's something where there's a mental health issue that is apparent when you label someone an EDP. We could just go forward again. No, we do need education. Look at this. In 2020, by the way, you see how that went down? Guess what? That shot up more in 2021. Why don't I have it? Because the FBI hasn't given us data that we can disaggregate this year. They've given us a little bit of data, but not that we can disaggregate. That would pop through the ceiling. So there's a seasonality with respect to hate crime and anti-Asian hate crime, and what I'm concerned about is if you look at correlations with victimization surveys, if you look to increases with respect to online hate, let me tell you something. The best professor in the Cal State system is here with you today, and he sits at the other end of the table. His data is correct, and his conclusions are correct. The toxic social media landscape, and when we saw a congressperson and Secretary of State use stigmatizing language against Asians, and then a week later we saw the president, guess what? Within days, anti-Asian hate crime on a day-to-day tick peaked. We do this, I've been doing this for decades. Hate crimes are not like all types of criminality. There's a printed circuit of stereotypes that Dr. Robin Williams of Cornell said label certain individuals as legitimate targets of aggression, and there are certain circumstances where people who would otherwise not be criminals and not offend do offend. Like probably that person who sprayed Lysol over that poor woman. And I don't understand how we can sit here today and make this a debate about affirmative action when we heard the testimony of Joanne Yu, and I'll tell you something, every time I go, and I'm going to shut up right now, just give me 1 second here. I came from California, just give me 1 second. Every time I go to panels and this and that, there are people from the Asian American community that come up to me and say, oh, my octogenarian parents were attacked twice in 6 months. Or someone else who's an attorney says, my car was attacked. We have to stop this, and we have to focus on education. And yeah, for people who murder Asian Americans, let them spend the rest of their lives in jail, but that's less than 1% of all offenders. I want to thank you so much for this privilege today, and thank you for what you're doing to make this country better for all our brothers and sisters, and especially our Asian American brothers and sisters who I care about so very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Levin, and thanks to all the panelists. I'm going to open up for questions, and I'll exercise the privilege of the chair and just ask if any panelist wants to respond to any other panelist.
Yeah, the majority of the anti-Asian hate crime offenders in the United States, according to the FBI, are white. One other quick thing. The top 50 cities, and we get most of the hard data, the high reporting is from cities, okay? They have different demographics. So I heard the same thing with regard to like a tweet that went viral about anti-Semitic attacks. Guess what? It's about 1% more, about 14%, something like that, black offenders on Jews nationally. But when you have people living right next door to each other, right, you're going to have a different type of offender mix. And of course, someone will exaggerate that and not use the overall data that is available. Thank you so much.
Yes, Ms. Yap?
I'd like to respond to Mr. Levin. Because you've brought up proximity, that is why I did include statistics about both directions of offending, because when you live close to somebody, they also live close to you. So if it's a matter of proximity, then the rate of violence should be pretty similar. I also did analysis on the neighborhood that the average Asian person lives in, and like what % of each race they live in, their neighbors are. So I do believe that's been addressed.
It's still wrong.
Mr. Zhang?
I'd like to really distinguish between hate incidents, which make up the great majority of our cases, and hate crimes, which make up a small fraction. We really need to address what the majority of Asian Americans are experiencing, what we're experiencing trauma from, are just regular microaggressions of verbal harassment, but they're not micro in their impact, right? We're getting shunned, we're getting spat upon, we're facing 8% of SOP API hate cases are civil rights violations. So you have to address the breadth of racism that Asian Americans are experiencing if we want to, again, serve our communities. So to focus solely on hate crimes, I think does a disservice, doesn't get to the roots of the issue. And again, the hate incidents that can then rise to the level of assault. And so that's why we need to get at the breadth of incidents. I think the other danger is conflating the crime that Asian Americans experience and then conflating that as any experience of crime is a hate crime. So I think Ms. Yap is correct that those of us living in low-income, maybe high-crime areas are victims of crime at high rates, but everybody in the community are victims of crime in those communities. So it's not necessarily black on Asian crimes. The black and African-American community, they're also victims of crime in those neighborhoods. So you have to be careful on focusing on race crimes, but instead, like Ms. Yap just said, look at the communities where there are high crime rates and distinguish them from the hate crimes that other people are experiencing.
Could I just respond to him for a second?
Sure, go ahead.
He's totally right. And one of the things that we like to do is take that crime data, this happens all the time. I'm so glad that you brought this up. We don't just use it singularly. We combine it where we can measure epithets online, and we look at the wonderful, God bless you, you're a hero of the Cal State system. This focus on victimizations beyond crimes, when we look at more data, like for instance, if a weather person just looked at barometric pressure, but didn't look at radar and didn't look at temperature changes, right? So we have to combine them, and we've been seeing what appears to be a shift in types of offenders, and that is, it looks like, at least according to Professor James Nolan, we have a piece coming out in Northwestern's Criminal Law and Criminology Review this month. It looks like that we're seeing an older set of offenders coming around now. But we have different types of hate offenders. One thing with regard to African Americans, because this comes up a lot, and it gets twisted, and it's wrong. It's not only statistically wrong, it's a moral evil, and I'm not going to be a part of it. If we look at New York City, for instance, we certainly did have attacks by African Americans against Asians. But when we went across the country where the demographics were different, we had a change. The other thing, too, is just look at this week about maternal deaths for African Americans with regard to births, right? So African Americans are more likely to be in poverty and have all kinds of, I come from a medical family, so this is, you can't imagine how funny the rest of my relatives are going to be looking at this, but access to health care, including mental health care, is far more limited with respect to the African American community. So some of that is, if we just went colorblind and said mentally ill offenders, we see a lot of offenders with respect to hate crime who have some type of mental illness. And the more we ignore that, not looking at it as a race thing, but looking at a poverty thing and a mental illness issue, I think that's more productive. We have to have education be a part of this. To say that hate crimes are just the same as all criminality, no. And I'm going to quote the dean, Jack McDevitt, who's the first one to come up with the typology back in 1989 at the American Society of Criminology. And I added the mentally ill offender, but he looks at the thrill offender, the defensive reactive offender who's reacting to a threat or a change in their neighborhood, and the mission offender like the neo-Nazi skinheads. There are different types of offenders, and they require, and America requires a different response.
What's the composition, the percentage-wise composition?
I'm sorry, percentage-wise composition?
So McDevitt and Levitt they derive their typology from their analysis of BPD data, right? And they
Correct.
say, what's the distribution of those three types within those offenders?
Well, when they first came out with it, it was the thrill
But there's
offenders.
a fourth one, but later, but sure, yeah.
What was the fourth one?
No,
they just divided defensive
This is
reactive.
the Bennett thing. But sorry, I just like an answer to the question, even in the original one, even in 89 or 93.
I'm sorry, what is your question?
What's the distribution?
They had much more thrill offenders. I think it's around 60%.
It's 66. It's about 32% rough.
Right, from
32%
1989.
Are defensive, yeah, but it's roughly the same in the 2003.
Right, which proves my point that it's
It's roughly
education.
the same in 2010. 1% are mission offenders.
Let's try to
Who
limit to
commit the
one.
most homicides?
Let's,
Yeah, and that's very
I'm going to have to
bad.
stop the crosstalk because the listeners are not going to be able to discern what's going on here. So for one person at a time, I'm going to have to call Mr. Yang.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to jump in here just to kind of refocus the discussion a little bit, because I think the discussion here, the purpose of this hearing is to talk about a federal response to anti-Asian racism. And so I think the panelists have all done a good job of talking about different viewpoints. You know, I still go back to sort of, I think where we all agree to varying extents is on education, is on investment to the community. We sometimes have differing opinions about what that means, but I think we need to think about what data means, because I think there's an agreement that there's data that matters, having relevant data matters, and the government plays a large role in that. Language matters, and the government, all of our policymakers, has a huge difference in how we talk about these issues and talk about these responsibly. So I would like to refocus there. I do want to speak to one thing that I want us to be very clear about with respect to sort of what I am hearing about the divisions between the African American and Asian American community. Let me be clear about this. Is there anti-blackness in the Asian American community? Yes, there is. Is there anti-Asianness in the black community? Yes, there is. And this is where, again, education is important. Right facts are important, because there are those that are trying to use these divisions to create wedges within all of our communities in a manner that is going to prevent progress. And so what I would urge all of us to do is think about how we get to better facts, how do we get to better data, how we are careful with our language and responsible with our language in how we move forward.
Mr. Lehman, did you want to respond? Ms. Yu?
I wanted to address the mental health question. We have to think about the lack of mental health support for victims, for the community in general. We scramble to find professionals who can speak the language that the victims need support in, not just the victims, but the families and the entire community. After last year, the entire Asian American community in New York City, we were afraid to leave our homes, and we were reeling every time we had to step outside. We all had tremendous anxiety, and young professional women working in corporations, making more in 1 year than I will ever make in my lifetime, they were calling me saying, how do I go to work? I'm afraid to get on the subway. What do I do? How do I navigate this? This has been very scary. We have tremendous anguish right now, and I appreciate these number conversations, and because that's where we need to start that. We are a census information center, so for us at the Federation, everything works starting with data and numbers, but the reality is there are real people behind those numbers, and we need to think about what is happening in my community. And I will tell you right now, my community, we are having a meltdown. This entire country is having a meltdown, and I appreciate these numbers conversations because that's what needs to happen, but I need to have solutions. I need to have funding to hire and train mental health professionals in language to be able to offer culturally competent programming so that way nobody's afraid to leave their homes and nobody's afraid to look at their neighbors and think that they're going to be attacked.
Any other commissioners? Questions? Ms. Garza?
Yes, I do have a question. Professor Jung? Did I pronounce that correctly? Jung, okay. So I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned in your testimony how political rhetoric and what we've seen happen around anti-Asian rhetoric has sort of fed into policies that are being put forth. I'm from Texas, and very recently our state legislature was considering a ban, and are still to an extent considering a ban on Chinese Americans owning property. Now it's been reshaped, and now it's businesses in particular. And so I was hoping I could hear from you or from any of the other panelists that have been looking at these issues. What are we seeing happen at the state level or in these policies that are implementing these anti-Asian sentiments and continuing to stoke anti-Asian sentiments across the country?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, that the policies implemented at the state level, at the local level, at school boards that, again, prohibit, for example, non-Americans from buying property, that then sanctions further violence because citizens recognize, well, if government thinks it's okay to exclude non-citizens from owning property, it's okay for us to then yell at exclude, mistreat individuals. So, and then policymakers then are emboldened to then pass further xenophobic policies. And I think that's what we see occurring. It's harkening back to the 19th century, the early 20th century, when we had several anti-Asian alien land laws, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And at the same time of the Chinese Exclusion Act and these alien land laws, we saw massive mass displacement of Asian communities. And people don't hear about that in history. Over 168 Chinese communities were actually forcibly driven out right after the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there is that sort of cause and effect, the correlation that if the government sanctions xenophobic policies, if it perceives certain communities as outsiders undeserving of rights, then mob violence then occurs. And so I think we have to be really careful at the state and local level and be on guard. And what the federal government's response should be is to really safeguard the communities. When you see sites that are banning books or instituting laws, land laws, those will then become hotbeds for interpersonal violence against Asians.
Yeah, if I might add on to that, and as you heard me testify, I recognize the real national security challenges we have. So my framework on some of these laws are, how does this actually benefit national security? And what expertise does the legislative body, or whatever body is involved, have in making that determination? And this is where I have serious concerns. Then the second question I have is, what is the impact, the residuals, the secondary impact that such legislation or policy will have on the community? One aspect of things such as alien land laws, the way these are being discussed, is would it be the right of the prior owner to look at citizenship papers, to look at business interests? How will this be enforced? Does the Attorney General get to sue? So those are the real policy implications that I think whether it is the federal government or state and local government should be thinking about in determining these things. Even setting aside, obviously, what we perceive to be some of the racist quality of these. Again, I want to give some deference to national security, but let's talk about this in a smart way.
Could I just interject real quick? Gallup, I think it was 2018, 11%, it was either 2017, 2018, 11% China, greatest enemy, 49% today. And again, using the same disclaimer that my friend John uses, yeah, there are legitimate issues that we have to address across a variety of things. But what ends up happening when politics gets thrown into that stew, once you put some dirt in the stew, there's dirt in the stew. And let me just give you an example about how legislation and other things can seem to correlate. We saw in 23 states legislation relating to transgender Americans and gender nonconforming Americans. And we saw our friends at Princeton, ACLED, showed a massive increase in protests, including violent protests, sometimes with folks like the Proud Boys showing up. Guess what we found is the second most attacked group in 2022? You're getting the latest data here. Gender nonconforming, top 5. Other races, gender nonconforming, LGBTQ mixed, anti-Semitic, anti-transgender. So even sometimes when we see, like for instance, anti-gay male and anti-lesbian either go down a little bit or stay flat, we see this mutation of othering. And it correlates to the kind of discourse that we're seeing in politics and also on social media, which is a whole other ball of wax that I'd love to see this commission handle at another time.
Thank you for that. I do have one more question for Ms. Yu, if I
I'm sorry,
can.
but this will have to be the last question because we're up on time now.
Okay. I do want to take it back to the very human aspect and what our Asian brothers and sisters are experiencing. What kind of support has your organization received? Where are the gaps? I'd like to hear more about the gaps in terms of making sure that the federal response is adequate.
Thank you for that question. I agree with John when he talked about funding coming through. There is a lot of money. When all the violence is happening, people are throwing money at you. And for us, we were throwing money back at the community to be able to build infrastructure. Literally, I've been telling my staff, we are building the airplane, we're paving the runway as we're flying this plane. And I honor my staff who never got to sleep in the first year because this is what we were doing. And it was great to have money. It was great to be able to pay for stuff, to be able to get things going, but the media gaze has slowed. And so now the money has slowed. And so we are trying, and the violence hasn't stopped. We need to be able to, and some of those federal applications, it is so cumbersome. Many of the nonprofit organizations in our community are small. They don't have the capacity to write sophisticated proposals. Some of these nonprofits function with 2-3 staff people. There isn't that capacity. There isn't the language capacity. There isn't the professional quality proposals that they can turn out. They've got to get the money deployed quickly on the ground, and it takes forever. It takes forever. And we are struggling because we are paying for not just victim services, but also figuring out how do we have program money so that way we can get food programs going for seniors? How do we make sure that we pay for therapists? How do we make sure that there's overall mental health programming in our community? And so I think if the government response, if I can change one thing, if I had a magic wand that I can change tomorrow, it would be that the funds deployed to our community comes faster without a lot of reporting, knowing that we are best equipped to know how to spend this money, because this is the work that we're doing.
And your staff is multilingual?
Yes, thank you. Many languages.
We talked about
Many
that, so I just wanna make
languages.
sure.
Many languages staff, but we also have member agencies, so that when we do anything, it gets translated into 7 to 10 languages. And our membership agencies have a lot of language capacity. So if we do a press conference, for instance, when we had a press conference on public charge, it was done in 10 languages. Yes, it took a little while, but every community needed to know what their rights were, deserved to know what the facts were. So it does take a while, it costs money, but this is how we communicate because this is what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have one question. I just need a clarification. Was I hearing it correctly that Texas is proposing some legislation to prohibit Chinese Americans from owning land or Chinese from owning land? Because I heard Chinese Americans.
Right, it has been a moving target. There have been amendments offered. Right now it is foreign nationals. Now it is more focused on business rather than on individual personal land ownership, from my understanding, but it is still a moving target.
And if such legislation is passed, my sense is it's because of a concern for national security, and there has been considerable purchase of land by the People's Republic of China in strategically sensitive spots in the United States of America. How do we address that?
You see, and you bring up a very good point. There can be cases made, and I want to be careful here because I am not an expert on national security, and I am not an expert on sort of how, when we talk about military installations where there have been some discussions. But there can be appropriate things. And if you think about CFIUS as being one of the places where we talk about these types of issues, they're appropriate fora to talk about these issues and how to address foreign investment and what that might do. That certainly the federal government in many ways is well equipped to do. But when we have state and local governments implementing these, and certainly the political debate in those climates have not focused on these nuances, that is where there is concern. And then the repercussions, again, I focus also on the impact on all of our communities being very, very drastic.
I want to thank the panelists. This has been very informative. We're going to be taking a short break. We'll reconvene at 2:25 with panel 2.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.